Victoria, welcome to LSAT Unplugged.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining. So I was really interested to chat with you. I recently learned through our previous conversation that you got into every single law school to which you applied. You mentioned a total of 6, focusing on Canada, and you mentioned some really unique work experiences you've had, and I imagine that you must have highlighted them in your application pretty well. So could you share more on that?
For sure. Yeah. So I have a bunch of really unusual experiences that don't really relate to each other. Beyond like my general writing experience and things that people just come into law school just generally having, like a great analysis background and things like that. I did stuff like work in a liver research lab, and I did a lot of writing professionally. So even for probably publications that people will be familiar with, like Teen Vogue, BuzzFeed News. My writing is actually studied at Purdue University, which is kind of weird. I'm in a
Wow.
textbook there. So yeah, I mean, I worked in large scale event planning. I did consulting. I've done administrative work for law firms. That's kind of related, but there's that. But the way I was really able to frame all of that in a way that I think put me above a lot of people, aside from the fact that just having a lot of these experiences is very odd, is just that I have this really strong writing background and this flair for kind of telling stories, especially in a written medium. So if you're looking to try and stand out, I think one thing that really helps is really putting a lot of effort into your personal statements, your essays, whatever they are. Like for me, I had to do one application where they were just all short answers in like those terrible little text box things.
Yeah.
Not really taking any of that for granted. And even if you don't have anything that you would think is really interesting, like to me, even if I just had like, oh, I did some freelance writing for, I don't know, Hello Giggles or something random. Um, Even if you just are able to think about, like, from your perspective, do you think that's cool? Because if you do think it's cool, you should probably convey that. Like for me, I think that all the things that I did were really cool and really interesting. And I tried my best to explain why and how, because the person who's reading your application isn't going to know maybe even what you're talking about. So it's your job to explain to them what is so inspiring and interesting and cool, and kind of how that also ties into what you're planning to do at law school. So for me, it was like, hey, I have all this writing stuff. For instance, that was one thing that I really focused on because I knew it was really odd, but in a good way. So I would say, hey, look, I did all this writing. It's on a wide variety of topics, literally almost every topic under the sun. And I have had a lot of experience looking into different subjects, and a lot of them did relate to law in some way, or law would be affected by them. And, this is my journey, and this is kind of how it led me to law school. And I think that that helps, like, like composing a compelling narrative ultimately is really the key, I think.
Yeah.
But like I said, I went ultimately to a school that didn't care about any of that. But
But you got into 6 schools and you had a lot of options before you there. And obviously that's a pretty good success rate too. Now I'm wondering, you have these impressive experiences and you also have obviously quite a bit of writing ability as well. So I'm wondering how you distilled those experiences into your application. I'll put aside the one with all the short essays because I want to keep this more broadly applicable for those who'd be applying to any law school, most of which have personal statement, diversity statement, optional essays and addenda, and so on. So I'm wondering how you might have chosen where to bucket those experiences.
great question. So I have gone through a lot of job interviews in my day. I am 22, just to put that out there. But I have had a lot of job interviews, weirdly, just because I've done so many weird things. So in those job interviews, I have had interviewers hone in on certain things that they think are really interesting and they want to hear me talk more about them. So one thing that I took into account was, what have people kind of had the biggest reaction to, like when they've looked at my resume, whether it's a career counselor or someone at school or a prof or an actual interviewer for a job. They'll kind of be like, wow, like I didn't know you did this, like why don't you tell me more about that? And just even if you don't have that interview like formal experience, if you are talking to people about what you've done in the past and they kind of have this taken aback sort of like, oh, tell me more about that sort of reaction, I think that's a good indicator that that's something that would definitely be interesting for someone who doesn't know you at all to hear about. So that was kind of what I did. Like I said, with the writing, people are kind of like, wow. So I really played that up. Another thing that I really played up was kind of like the consulting experience, just because that was really unusual. That's unusual in my city. I think there was one consulting, it was through my co-op in business school, and there was only one position for all of the whole like co-op program for that. So yeah, it was for like a pretty big company, and so I played that up too. And yeah, just taking stock, like what do you know in your mind, like what's most interesting about you and what you've done. So play that up, like don't hide. This is your time to showcase what you're made of and impress people.
I think that's key. You weren't afraid to put it out there, to showcase it, to highlight it. And for those who may not be so sure, I know that you seem pretty certain about highlighting things. You also have a really impressive resume, work experience. Some people may not feel they do, even if they actually do. And so I think having those conversations with other people and seeing what gets a reaction, what doesn't, experimenting could have a major impact in deciding what to highlight.
Oh, 100%. You need to be unafraid to just kind of like, I think people do this in interviews too. They're too afraid to like actually say like, yeah, I am really cool and really impressive and I could do a good job, So yeah, just having the confidence to sell yourself essentially. It's not in a bad way, but this is what you have to do because they're not going to know unless you tell them.
Exactly. Now, how many, for the more standard applications, like I mentioned, personal statement, diversity statement, optional essays and addenda, and so on, how many of those kinds of statements did you write for a given application?
I think I had a draft of 3 that just kind of like were a little bit different. And then depending on the application, I would just splice them together. That's just a natural thing that comes to me because I've done so much writing. I think anyone who's applying to law school has done probably a lot of writing. So I would say have different versions depending on, the school. So what they are focused on. And then, so I had one for more holistic schools, one for more numbers-based schools where they probably didn't care as much. And I would just edit as needed.
Nice. Thanks for that. Anything else you'd want to share with those applying to law school now in the process of putting together their applications?
I would say I really beat myself up the entire process. Despite me saying all this stuff about confidence, internally, I was kind of like, well, there's always a chance that I won't get into anything, I guess, because there's so many what ifs when it comes to applying to law school. You don't know how you're going to do on the LSAT. Until you do. And then you don't really know what your grades for the next semester will be like. For me, I had so much doubt that I actually ended up like dropping a class, and then I had to overload on the next semester because it was a mandatory course. So I had to take it. So I would say like try to let go of that as much as possible. I think maintaining healthy doubt is good, but giving yourself panic attacks that's too much. It's not effective anymore. So yeah, I think that's it. But I think if it'll work out for you, whatever path you're meant to take is what you will end up taking.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Victoria. Do you want to share a little bit about your YouTube channel and where folks might be able to follow you for more?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of decided to start this YouTube channel just because I figured I needed to get this knowledge out there before I completely forgot what it felt like to be applying on this process. And, have a little bit of fun. I love to talk, obviously. So yeah, you can find me at Victoria, not Vicky on YouTube. And the same is on Instagram if for some reason you want to follow me. I love making friends, so please do so.
Perfect, Victoria. Really appreciate you sharing your insights with everyone.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.